Hey. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. We've been having a micro learning or let's talk every week. So this has been really fun. As an introvert, it's been kind of a little bit of a challenge for me, but I've been wanting my book launch is next week in April. So I wanted to make sure we got all of these micro learnings and let's talks, and I didn't want to skip any. So we've been so fortunate to have these amazing speakers every week in the month of March. Today's micro learning is how to get on podcasts with Jessica Rhodes. Um, Before we start in the chat, please enter your name and what city you're coming from. If you want to network, add your LinkedIn profile. For those who are watching this via live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, X, etc., we want you in the conversation as well. So introduce yourselves in the comment or the chats wherever you're at. And once again, if you want to broaden your LinkedIn connections, include your LinkedIn profile as well. For those who are new to Community of Seven, the purpose of these calls is to help our listeners elevate their mindset and skill set by bringing in leading authors, coaches, executives, founders, and subject matter experts. These talks have been going on for 4 years now. Um, I think we mainly kind of focused on the mindset for a while, and then I had listeners and folks who are online tell me, "Well, how do you actually do it?" And so this is why I love having subject matter experts like Jessica to kind of show and guide people how to get on podcasts, how to elevate your thought leadership. So once again, this is a micro learning. It's a training and development that focuses on small, bite-sized information with just the right amount of information to help learners achieve a goal. So for today, it's basically how you can get on podcasts. And we don't want you to passively listen. We want you engaging. And if you have a great quote, if you have a great podcast recommendation, I want you to kind of include it in the chat or comment wherever you're watching this from. And once again, this micro learning is about how to get on podcast. And for those who are in the live Zoom audience, if you can, please turn on your videos because I know for me and Jessica, it makes it a lot more comfortable when we can see your faces. And if you don't, that's fine as well. But it's always helpful to see a face. So I'm going to go kind of straight into it. One of the things I can say is that as an introvert, it was really hard for me to kind of do this micro learning, or I call them live streams. So it's a little bit different format than a podcast. But especially with me releasing my book, being on podcast has been a game changer for me. And I've probably been, because I've been on the promo kind of tour for Do This Daily, I've been on 30 podcasts probably since late last year. And it's been such a game changer for me. And one of the benefits of being on podcast as well is you really get to redefine or refine your talking points if you are public speakers or if you want to be a public speaker. It really kind of helps you be able to articulate your points succinctly. And because there's hopefully volume in it, it can really be beneficial for you. And I love Jessica's POV because, especially for those of you who are on this call, we have a good mixture of people who are executives working at Fortune 500 companies, but we also have a lot of great people who are entrepreneurs, founders, people kind of like creating their own solopreneurship or businesses. So these talks, I think, are helpful because it can really kind of help guide you to, okay, you're watching other people do it. Now, how can I do it? So once again, I'm so excited to introduce our guest, Jessica Rhodes. Let me spotlight her real quick. Hi, Jessica. So,
Hello.
hi. So Jessica Rhodes is a founder and president of Interview Connections. Jessica invented the podcast guest booking industry with her partner when she started booking podcast interviews for private clients in 2013. There were no other services like it in the market. While most other podcast bookers just focus on getting you booked, her team of in-house booking agents and strategists help her clients target highly targeted shows and provide training and coaching to help monetize your visibility. So, welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here and so pleasantly surprised to have an audience on Zoom. I wasn't sure if we would have folks here or just
Yeah.
on live stream, but I'm so happy to be here and to teach as much as I can in this time to help you all leverage podcasting because this is a great strategy for both
Yeah.
executives and entrepreneurs. So I'm excited to dive in.
And I think what I love about, we have a lot of people watching it via live stream too, but what I like about the live Zoom audience is that you can actually have questions and interact with people and actually, be in the comments like Donna says hello. You're able to kind of really engage with people. So I think that's kind of why I've kept the live Zoom audience. We've been experimenting it for 3, 4 years, but I like the live Zoom audience. Just seeing the beautiful faces too, like seeing everyone smile.
Yeah.
It just makes me happy. Hi, Linda. I see your smile. Um, so first question, what makes podcast guesting a valuable tool for professionals, both professionals and entrepreneurs? Because we have a mixture of both kind of in our audience and watching this via live stream.
Yeah, well, I'm going to piggyback first off of something you've already talked about, which is how it really helps you hone your message. And that is one of the biggest benefits, kind of hidden benefits that podcast guesting brings to everyone, whether you're an executive leader, an entrepreneur, a business owner, an entrepreneur. When you get interviewed on podcasts about your story and about your area of expertise, you become a much more skilled speaker. You get better and better at delivering your story, about delivering your tips and your actionable advice. For a lot of people are responders. And so they work really well when they're being asked questions and the information is pulled out of them. Because when you're asked certain questions, it will inspire stories and tips that you may not have thought to just put into a prepared presentation. So, from that respect, podcast guesting is great because it really keeps your content fresh. The questions a host asks you are from their point of view, from their curiosity and their experience. So it's going to pull things out of you that you may not have thought to prepare because once you become an expert and you're in your business for so long, what you think is obvious is not always obvious to your target audience. So that's why interviews are excellent is because people will ask you questions that you just may not have thought they'll ask you questions to get information that you may not have thought to prepare.
Yeah, can I actually give you an example of how true this is? So, I do public speaking for a living. So I do corporate training, development. Companies pay me to come in and speak or to train. I've trained teams of 500. However, when I was doing my book tour, my first, I guess I had a fireside chat to talk about the book, and was a loss for words. And I wish I had done more podcast interviews before then to kind of refine my talking points because literally the host asked me questions, and though I talk publicly, as a living publicly, it's different when you're having someone ask you specific questions about a book or your subject matter expertise or whatnot. And Ed Drossman, who's my publicist, is on this call. And I would rather make mistakes on a podcast that can be edited rather than if he books me for like a live TV show. Right. So those are things you don't think about. I'm only thinking about it now because I'm releasing my book, but like you want to have as many touch points in terms of like speaking your story, right? And I think that's kind of what you're kind of talking about as well.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that perspective because something that I always love to share as well, especially for speakers. So, speakers often come into podcast guesting and are like, I'm a great speaker. I'm going to be a great podcast guest. But they are two different skills because
Yes.
sometimes speakers will come in and they will kind of railroad the conversation because they're like, I'm a speaker. I'm going to give my talk. And the host does not get a word in edgewise. And so,
Yeah.
it's important as a speaker that you recognize this is a conversation. You want to allow the podcast host to also interject their stories. And so, one tip I want to offer to everyone getting interviewed is you give your answer and then know when to stop
Yes.
where the period is. Because sometimes you're like, I just have to keep talking. But don't wait for the host to interrupt you because that is going to be a little bit messy. So give your answer and know when the powerful place is to stop and let the host join into the conversation.
I'm nodding my head because I've interviewed probably 150 people, and it's like you can tell the ones that are pros and the ones who are like, they're very great at their craft, but it's a very different animal, public speaking and podcast interviewing or just interviewing for a show like a TV show. So how has the landscape of podcast guesting changed in recent years? And what are some strategies in terms and maybe benefits for podcasting now compared to how I think you started this out in 2013 with your agency. What's been the progression and what should we know?
Great question. So I love talking about this because it really helps kind of give the perspective of what you need to be prepared for when you're podcast guesting in 2024. So 2013 when I started, I believe the number of total podcasts that were out there was about 300,000, maybe less. There weren't that many shows. Now I believe it's over 3 million. So the industry has
Wow.
grown incredibly rapidly. There's more shows and roughly the same amount of people. So one thing you want to know is that there's a lot more podcasts, and yes, more people are listening to podcasts now than they were in 2013. So technically like there are more people listening to podcasts, but there are a lot more shows for people to choose from. So it's quite common that you'll see podcast audience sizes are a little bit smaller per show because there's more people. A top 1% podcast has under 4,000 downloads per episode. So a lot of people say, I want to be on top 1% show. I want, 50,000 listeners. If you want to be on top 1% show, that's about 4,000 listeners. A top 10% show has just under 400 listeners. And so I just say that so you have the facts. I'm not saying that's good or bad. That's just what is. And so when you're going on podcasts now, it's important to understand that you're speaking to a very targeted audience. And that's also the benefit. You don't have a whole mix of people. Maybe some of them are your ideal client and some of them aren't because it's just you'll get on a show and it's just for entrepreneurs and it could be someone starting their business or an executive. Now there's so many shows where you can really get in front of your ideal target audience. The other thing about podcast guesting in 2024 is that podcasters have really upped their game. So when I was first booking podcast interviews, it was really a business owner with Skype. Like everyone was just on Skype or Blog Talk Radio. Like it was, calling in on the phone. Like the audio quality was so bad, but that's just what the standard was. It was just that was 2013, that was 2014. And now there's a lot more equipment. I mean, talk about the number of shows, the amount of money that's come into the industry has created new businesses. It's created a lot more microphones. Microphones are less expensive. It's created a lot more softwares where you can be having better audio quality without having to use a whole, external like soundboard and everything. Like 10 years ago, you needed a soundboard and these crazy microphones to have good sound quality. Now you can just use Riverside or Squadcast or something really simple. So that has changed. And so with that, podcasters are really taking their show more seriously. Most podcasters are doing a pre-production call. Some people call it a pre-call, some people call it a prep call. It's a call separate from the time of the interview where they can talk with the guest. They can kind of talk about what the topics and questions will be. They'll check your sound, make sure you're using a microphone, look at your lighting. Like they will have a pre-production meeting before the interview. And I spend a lot of we talk to our clients about this because even a couple of years ago, guests would say, well, I don't have time for pre-calls. And now I say, if you're going to podcast guest in 2024, you need to factor in time for pre-calls because it's become much more standard in the marketplace now to just keep that quality level of the shows higher because there's a lot more competition. There's a lot more shows for people to choose from.
So we have some really good questions from the audience. Ed asked, "How do you know what podcasts are the most popular?" And Gigi's asked, "How do you know the download listeners for each show?"
Yeah, so I'll start with Gigi's question and then I'll go to Ed. So the number of downloads that a podcast has is not public. So there's actually no way to know exactly how many listeners a show has. If they're posting their podcast to YouTube, yes, YouTube, you can see the number of views that a video has, but in terms of the number of listens, streams, downloads on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of the podcast apps that are out there, those numbers are only provided in the podcast host media hosting account. So it's not information that we as consumers can access. There are softwares and directories that will make an estimated, an educated guess based off of certain factors and algorithms and things like that. But as of now, there's no way to know exactly how many listeners a show has. And so going to Ed's question, how do you know which podcasts are the most popular? So the way you want to come to what I would encourage you to ask is, how do I know which shows are the right fit for me? Because if you're looking at what are the most shows that are most popular, is that just like, do I want to listen to a podcast and find the best one? Or is it, how do I know which shows I should be a guest on that's the best use of my time? So I'm going to kind of take that question and just alter it a little bit for this audience. And so a couple of the factors that you want to look for that are available to you is, how many episodes has the show published? I personally, and I won't book my clients on shows with less than 20 episodes. So if a host reaches out to me and they're like, I'm starting my show, I haven't published it yet, but I'm getting guests together. Like, years ago, when I was first starting out, I'll do anything. I'll get on any podcast. Now I'm running a 7-figure business. I'm doing 100 sales calls a month. I'm not going to do just any show. So I need to see that at least has 20 or more episodes, because a lot of podcast hosts will quit their show before 20 episodes. They'll be like, this is hard. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of money. I don't want to do this anymore. So I only one time I was on a show, it was a long time ago. I did the episode. They never published the show. They just quit. I'm like, well, that was a waste of my time because nobody heard that interview. So focus on shows that have at least 20 or more episodes to show that the host is, kind of in their groove. They're building an audience. Look at their social media following. This is an important factor. So we're all here, we're all active on LinkedIn, I would guess. There are podcast hosts who may have 200 listeners. Maybe it's a top 15% show, 200 listeners, a modest size audience. However, they've built up a LinkedIn following of, say, 20,000 followers. They're really active on LinkedIn. They will post clips of your episode with them on LinkedIn. They may get more people watching the clips and reaching out to you than they would have listening to a full 35-minute episode. My client, Christina Woods, is a hypnotherapist and an empowerment coach. She posts mini clips, like 30-second clips of her podcast interviews to social media. She got a client, somebody who just saw the clip. So it's not always about how many listeners a show has. It's finding the show that's going to position you in the best light, be the most relevant to your area of expertise, and then leveraging that interview in as many different ways as you can. Oh, you're muted.
Rookie mistake. Sorry. Uh, so the question everyone is waiting for: how do you book yourself on podcasts? What are some tips and trips, for some people who might be new to this whole podcasting world?
Yes. So the first thing you want to do is have a podcast one sheet. So this is it's similar to a speaker sheet. I invented the podcast one sheet when I was first booking interviews, because as I was reaching out, my dad was my first client actually. And so as I was pitching my dad, he's a business coach on podcasts, the host would all ask kind of the same thing. What's his bio? What are some questions I can ask him? And what are some topics? And so we put together a one pager back in 2013. It was a Microsoft Word doc where we just kind of put some text boxes together. They're a lot prettier now, but essentially it gives a host everything they need to quickly see, is this person a good fit for my show? And could you provide me some questions so I don't have to do all the work to prepare for the interview on my own? So you just give them what they need. So having a podcast one sheet is the first step in getting booked, because when you create a one sheet, you will see some people will post on social media, hey, I'm looking for guests for my podcast, or you'll just have opportunities that come across your desk, so to speak. And if you have a one sheet, it's really easy to say, hey, I'd love to be a guest. Here's my one sheet. Do you want to have me on the show? So having a one sheet is a really good first step in being available for podcast interviews. I love when I see that people have, available for podcast interviews on their website, on a press page. I mean, put it out there to attract opportunities to you. So that's a really good way to get interviewed. And then in terms of actually going out and getting booked consistently, there's a few different options. You can do it yourself. So you can go out and research and find shows and which are interview based, find them in your topics. That does take a bit of time, but it's, you either want to spend, you're going to spend time or money making this happen. So you can do it yourself, research and find different podcasts to be a guest on, reach out to the host, show them your one sheet, communicate why you believe your topic will be a good fit for their audience. I wouldn't overthink the pitch. That's it. Why is your topic going to bring value to their listeners? That's the answer that hosts want to know. Do your research. Don't send one templated pitch to a million hosts that it's not going to be a good fit for. So that's one option. You can have an assistant do it. This is not my first recommendation because most assistants don't know how to pitch and book podcast interviews, or you can work with an agency, and that's the service that we provide. We've been doing it for 11 years. So those are basically the three options for getting booked: doing it yourself, having a team member do it, or working with an agency that can do it for you.
So, how important is niching down? So, there's a saying, it doesn't really rhyme because I'm saying niches instead of niches, but riches are in the niches.
Yep.
How important is that?
So, yeah, this is the type of saying that I kind of take with a grain of salt because it is really important to know your niche, to know your target market, and to go for those targeted podcasts. But the double edged sword is that if you're too specific, you're too targeted, you have your blindfolds up, sometimes you miss out on podcasts that would actually bring a lot of value to you. So, let's say, for example, you are a marketing expert for spa business owners. Like marketing is your topic, spa business owners is your, target audience. And so you're just looking for marketing shows for spa business owners. Like that would be hitting the nail on the head. There's only going to be so many podcasts that are hitting the bullseye in terms of the right topic, the right target audience. But you could go on a show for local business owners. It's not going to be 100% spa business owners in that audience, but there might be some. And a local business owner that's next door to a spa business owner might say, "Hey, you should listen to this podcast I just heard." So there's the, power of referrals. You could go on a general marketing show and be positioned for your expertise, take that recorded interview, promote it to your list, which is your target audience. So, yes, you want to be focused, you want to be niche down, but you don't want to be so niche down where you don't see the forest through the trees. You don't see that there is opportunity to be on shows that aren't necessarily speaking to your target audience, but you could repurpose that content and promote it to your audience because you likely have your ideal clients following you on social media or on your email list.
I love that. Um, so I found Jessica because I was Googling podcast one sheet. And she has some great examples on her website. So make sure you go to the website. During the break, I'll put in the link to her website, or I don't know if you can, Jessica,
I can
while
grab
we're
it.
on
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm.
but you have some great examples of, because I've been avoiding podcasts for the past 3 years. I did it in the beginning when I was launching Community of Seven, but as an introvert, I don't like talking a lot. I know the irony because I speak for a living, but that's another story. But when I had to start promoting my book, I was like, I need to get on podcast. And so I researched everything and got to your website. Um, so tell us a little bit more about what your company does, because I think it's helpful. Some people might be interested. I've been kind of doing my own podcast bookings, or because I've gotten a lot of outreaches and throughout the years. But for the folks who are on the call, Matt Mahler has a question. How much does it cost generally to hire a podcast agency? And what are the functions that you guys do as a podcast agency?
Yeah. So the way we've structured our service is that there are agencies out there that it's just like month to month, it's just pitches and bookings, and that's what you get. We have created at Interview Connections a comprehensive program. So it's called our Amplified Authority program. And we've created this because we found in the past, years and years ago, when we just pitched and booked our clients on podcasts, not every client would see an ROI. Not every client was actually monetizing their interviews. And so we looked at why is it working for some people and not for others? And the clients that we saw that weren't monetizing, they weren't seeing the full results. When we actually looked under the hood of the car, so to speak, we found, oh, well, their topics and questions could kind of be tightened up. They're not super compelling, or their call to action is they're giving 5 different calls to action. They're losing conversions there. And so we found all these little points where wow, if we tweaked that, if they tweak that, they could actually see an ROI. It's not that the strategy doesn't work, but some people implement the strategy perfectly and they do all the things to repurpose and leverage it. They see an ROI, and some people don't. And so we've added in coaching to our program because we want to make sure that everyone is set up for success. We do have clients that are sales and marketing experts. So just comes natural to them. They know how to repurpose and how to market and all of that. But then when it comes to actually delivering the message on the podcast, we can give advice there. And so, our program, we do 30 guaranteed bookings. We also bring our clients together for networking calls as well. So we have a great client community and we do interview audits. So it's very comprehensive, full service. And so our program, it is in the range of, depending on when you listen to this, prices may change, but it's about 1850 per month, 10 months, or you can do a pay in full, which is 17K. And that's basically working with us for a full year. So we do a month of onboarding. We make your one sheet. We create a guest expert media kit. We pitch and book you on podcasts about 3 shows a month for the next 10 months. And that's kind of the bite size of what it looks like. And I encourage if anyone's interested to reach out and book a call with me.
I love that. And Jessica's the website for Interview Connection is in the chat as well. What are some more common mistakes that people make when trying to get booked on podcast, and how can they avoid those mistakes?
Yeah. So one of the mistakes that people make is well, the first thing is they don't follow up. So that's just like implementation wise. 35% of the bookings that we get for our clients come from a follow up. So if you are doing this yourself to get started and you're just sending out pitches and nothing is coming back, you do have to have that tenacity and that persistency to follow up, to be scrappy, to figure out how do I get in front of these podcast hosts. So being persistent, really putting your all into the outreach process is really important. The other thing is a lot of people will you know, let me just say this, you get what you pay for in most businesses and most industries. And so I think a big mistake people make is they want to do it on the cheap. And so they'll hire, a virtual assistant or somebody that's never done this before because it's really cheap. But then your reputation is on the line. You're being pitched. And if you're being pitched to shows that aren't a good fit, it is your name and your image and your reputation, your brand that's on the line. So just be really mindful. I'm in full support of if you can't hire an agency, do this yourself or have a team member do it that you can like oversee the process. But that is a mistake that kind of like makes me cringe because it is your reputation that's on the line. And I don't want you to save a dollar here, but then it costs you so much in potential visibility. So just, do this right, do this intentionally, do it strategically, but do it because podcast interviews are so powerful. It's networking, it's visibility, it's building your brand, it's building your thought leadership. And more people are listening to podcasts. This is the way to get really deep, engaged viewership on your content.
And is there a difference between, video podcasts are a lot more popular? Mine is a video podcast. I don't actually distribute in the podcast channels, mainly out of laziness, but I mainly distribute through YouTube. So is there a difference between video podcast and the traditional podcasts that are more, I guess, just audio?
I think it's just kind of whatever someone's preference is. Usually a host will have their medium of choice that they put the most kind of effort into. And so some people, they really go well in on their YouTube and have a mainly like a video interview show, whereas others are really focusing on the audio platform, but then they'll kind of throw the video up as an afterthought. And so I don't think it's kind of just wherever your focus is.
Mhm.
But there's benefits to both. I love the video platform because it's just much easier to share and leverage. And so I always love when hosts, even if their primary platform is the audio podcast that's mainly listened to on, Apple or Spotify, to still have a video recording of the interview that then you can leverage on social media.
Yeah, I'm seeing more of that, just from my experience in these 30 past podcasts I've done in the past 3, 4 months. Though the ones that actually they videotape it on, I could think on the Zoom or whatnot, but then they record it in another vehicle. That way they actually are able to splice the videos and then post them on social, which is helpful. Um, so how, let me see, how do you determine what the what a good match is in terms of what the podcast and your, I guess part of that might be understanding what your selling point is and what like the audience you're trying to reach. But what is the process of kind of going through that? I know your team kind of does that for entrepreneurs and clients, but if I were just kind of watching this today, how do I kind of determine this is a fit, this is not a fit?
Yeah. So the first thing is to know what are your goals for being a podcast guest. That's one of the first questions I ask anyone that kind of comes into our community is why do you want to be on podcast? What are your goals? So for you, like knowing that your goal is to promote your book, that's a big reason why you're out there on podcast. Then the next question is, well, who's the ideal reader? Who do you want to get this book in front of? And what are their, demographics, psychographics? Who are they? What are they interested in? What keeps them up at night? What do they want to learn about? Who are they following? What are they listening to? So knowing what your goals are is then going to determine who do you need to speak to in order to meet that goal. If you want to promote your book, well, you need to speak to potential readers and people that would be interested in your book. If you want clients, who's your ideal client? Who's that ideal target audience? What shows are they listening to? So once you define your goals and then you define your target audience, and then after that, being very clear on your expertise. So, what are your topics? What are your questions? One of the best topics and questions for your one sheet are going to clearly communicate that you understand your target audience's pain points, their interests, and you show that you have a solution to that pain point, to that solution to that interest. So when you communicate that to a host, they know that by bringing you on the show, you're going to bring value to that audience. So once you're really clear on who your target audience is and how your topics will be helpful to them and relevant to them, then it's about identifying, well, what shows might they be listening to? What podcasts might they be interested in? What podcasts are they hosting? If your target audience are entrepreneurs, business owners, leaders, people that are creating content just like you, a really big benefit of podcast guesting is the relationships that you form with the host of the show. So just by you having me on this show, Len, like we now have more of a connection because we're here on Zoom. We're talking back and forth. I now know so much more about you than I did before this interview. So a huge value of podcast guesting is not just the visibility to somebody's audience, but it's the relationship that you get from that host. So that's one strategy for selecting and knowing if a show is the right fit. Don't even think about the audience, but who is the host? Look them up on LinkedIn, look them up on social media. What do they do? Who are they? And would a relationship with this person be valuable? Like, could you bring value to them? Could they bring value to you? Is there something that could come out of that relationship? And if the answer is maybe or yes, then it would be a great opportunity to do a podcast interview with them.
I love that. So let's talk about the benefits. I mean, I you kind of briefly went over the benefits of being on podcasts. Can you give us some, I'm sure you have tons of examples of clients that you've had and success stories, like whether they're entrepreneurs or I don't know if you have some clients that are actually employees of companies like Fortune 500 companies or something. Because I think it's a different mindset that you have if you're an employee opposed to an entrepreneur. There's different goals, right? If you can give some examples of like,
Mhm.
how it's benefited them.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do have some clients that are larger companies. And so they have their executive leaders go on podcasts, but the majority of our clients are the entrepreneurs, the thought leaders, the industry experts who really want to build their personal brand, increase their visibility to ultimately generate leads and sales for their business. And so we've got tons of case studies and examples that I love, and the benefits are, range. So the first one that comes to my mind that is really great for speakers is our client, Winnie Chan Wang. She got a speaking opportunity. Somebody who heard her on a podcast reached out, loved the interview, and said, I want you to be the keynote at my charity gala. So that's one specific example, many more like that with clients who attract in person live speaking opportunities from podcasts. Christina Woods, who I mentioned earlier, she's a clinical hypnotherapist and an empowerment coach. She posted on social media that she got booked for a podcast, and somebody saw that and invited her to be a speaker at their retreat. And then when she spoke at the retreat, she got clients from the retreat. So the podcast was kind of what invited this opportunity to speak, and then she got clients from the event that she spoke at. And then we have clients that are selling consulting and agency services that they'll, their contracts are quite large, $100,000 clients, and they've attracted those leads and sales from podcasts. And then the last example, as you can see, I could go on and on about this because we got a lot of examples, but our client, Mike Maynard, owns a very successful, like high seven-figure marketing agency, and he's working with very large contracts. So he's not looking for volume. He has very large contracts. There's a very long sales cycle from, proposal all the way to a contract being signed. So he's not necessarily seeing listeners of the show just reaching out and becoming his client, but what he'll do is he will take an interview that he did on a podcast and include it in the proposal. He includes it so that makes him stand out as an agency that is out there as a thought leader and as an authority. And so that makes him stand out and look different from his competitors and the other agencies that are trying to get that contract. So it's a way that you can, leverage your thought leadership in your sales cycle.
I love that. Missy Bright in the comments says, we are frequently using podcast guests and hosts as people we want to speak to an HR executive group in Arizona. Awesome. And Gigi, you have a great question. Do you feel comfortable unmuting and asking your question, or do you want me to ask it? Okay. Gigi, I'll ask a question for you. So Gigi has a question. Any advice for specific microphones, cameras, software, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. So the microphone that I'm using is the one that I recommend to my clients. It's the Audio Technica ATR 2100. It's a USB microphone, so you just plug it in to your computer and just check the sound settings so that it's picking up the microphone. And then you just want to get a mic stand. So this is a mic stand that I use. There's a bunch of them on Amazon, but the ATR 2100 is perfect for podcast guests. I did a whole tutorial. I have a free Facebook group called Guest Expert Profit Lab, and in there I did a tutorial on podcast guest tech. So I talked about how to choose microphones. So again, this is a dynamic microphone. You want to have it right up close to your face because if you back away, it really changes the sound. So the ATR 2100 is perfect. Honestly, I have a MacBook Air and I just use the internal camera because I think it looks fine. I know that some people upgrade and they'll have kind of like the blurred background. It's clearly higher quality, but I just personally haven't felt like I haven't really invested a ton in video quality because I have really great lighting. Like I have a nice panel light that provides very even lighting. I block out the sun so you don't have a glare, and then a nice microphone, and I'm pretty much good to go. So, and then for softwares, I mean, as a guest, you'll obviously just use whatever software the host is sending to you. So, we're on Zoom, there's Riverside, like a lot of browser based. You shouldn't have to download anything. It's mostly browser based softwares that you'll use for podcast guesting.
I love that. And for to answer Missy too, when I was kind of starting out, YouTube has tons of content as well. So I would suggest going to Jessica's Facebook group, but also you could also just search under YouTube, and there's so many setups for at home studio setup, and you could do it relatively cheaply now, probably under $500 or a few $100s. Mics you can get for $50, $60. And you don't even need a mic, honestly. I mean, yes, you do for like quality sound, but you don't necessarily need it. And Jessica put the link in our Zoom group, and I'll also cut and paste it into for those who are watching this via live stream as well. So I'm going to open this up to questions soon, but I have a quick question for you. So in the chat, for those who are kind of in the live Zoom audience or watching this from in live stream, how many podcasts do you watch in a week? How many podcasts do you watch in a week? I'm going to count down 3, 2, 1. Press send. If you can, how many podcasts do you watch in a week? Wait, I'm not seeing anyone answering. So there. Oh my gosh, 114, Linda. Do you sleep? 3, several, 10 to 14. Okay. 15 to 20. Okay, that's considerable. 2. Okay, awesome. And tell me in the chat right now, what's your favorite podcast? So if you're watching this via live stream or you're in the live Zoom audience, what's your favorite pod? And you don't have to mention me because I'm not really a podcast. So Diary of a CEO, Goop, Talk Easy. Patrick says I don't watch TV. Mel Robbins, awesome. You can learn Chinese. Oh, I got to check that out. I'm going to check out all of these podcasts afterwards. So I want to open this up for questions. Does anyone have a question? You could just let me know in the chat or use the raise your hand emoticon. And while I wait for, oh, sorry, Jennifer, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Lon. I am fairly new too. I've participated and been in podcasts helping other people just kind of on the side. This is kind of my new opportunity now to make that entry for myself. And I was just curious how I find my people because my demographic is young people. So people probably under 30, specifically like talking about financial literacy in a really fun way, not in a scary way and not geometry and trigonometry. We're talking actual math. So girl
Yeah.
math
And
maybe
The
is what we'll
great
call it.
question. Great question.
so your target, so you're talking about financial literacy and your target audience are people kind of in their 20s?
Yes.
I mean, the first thing I would do is actually just look up financial literacy podcasts. And I would just get on as many financial literacy podcasts, like anything in that realm,
Okay.
because some of your target audience may already be like they're actively seeking. Well, this is actually a good question for you. Do you know if your target audience is kind of aware that they want to learn about financial literacy and they may be seeking it out, or are you trying to like teach them, hey, you have to learn about
Yes,
this?
a great question, Jessica. I'm trying to redefine what girl math is. So I want to explain to people that it's everyday things they do, and also men as well, making decisions that affect them in a way that's really like easy to consume.
Yeah. Yeah, I would focus on financial literacy shows and just really get visible because and this is a good tip for anyone just knowing with your topic, is your target audience actively seeking out that information? Because if so, you just want to be visible on the shows that they would likely be finding when they're googling for the information that you have. And also the hosts of the show, they're going to know where your target audience is as well. So it's always good to get on shows that that are relevant to your topic, because the more well connected you can be in your industry and with people that are talking about relevant topics, the more your name will get passed around, your links to your interviews will get passed around. And then let's say you find your target audience on Instagram or TikTok or any type of social media. If you're actively publishing and posting about interviews you're doing, you can find them and attract them that way.
And Jennifer, let me give you a practical tip too. You have to kind of look at YouTube or what is where's the Apple, what is it, where the Apple videos are, podcast are, what is it called?
Apple Podcasts.
Apple Apple Podcasts. They're search engines too. So there's a
Okay.
search zone. So you could just say financial literacy young women or whatnot. And you could do that through YouTube as well. I think YouTube is probably the number two, three biggest search engine, even though we think of it as a video platform. People are searching. I know I searched to like, how do I fix a toilet or how do I unplug something? I used it as a search function as well. So you have to just use YouTube and Apple Podcast as in their search function, and it'll pull up, and you can rank them in terms of top podcast as well. So that's a good way to reach out. But just keep in mind that it's a lot harder to get interviewed in the top podcast. So you might want to kind of dig deep and then start with the podcast with less reach in the beginning as you
Okay.
hone down your talking points and your the flow and everything
Yeah.
before you get into the big podcast would be my recommendation.
Thank you. Great feedback. Thank you both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just put a link to the website called Listen Notes. That is an excellent podcast search engine. So you can search Listen Notes for certain types of podcasts. Another thing is, what other experts in your industry are talking about financial literacy? And because active experts that are out there podcast guesting, go look at what shows they're guesting on, and that will give you can piggyback off of them.
That's a great tip. And to kind of piggyback on the example that you gave in terms of the benefits of podcasting. So I'm speaking in Saudi Arabia, London, Cannes, and those were all a result of me either speaking, through my microlearning or posting daily on LinkedIn, right? So when you think about thought leadership, don't think about it in terms of selling. Think of it in terms of how can I benefit the person who is watching this? Because when you come from that mind frame, the content comes out differently as well. So Missy has a question. Would you be suspect of people who came to you on LinkedIn and asked you to be a podcast guest because of your profile? I mean, I would say I always click on the link and I look at how many followers they have. I'll give you an example. One reached out and I clicked on it and I was like, there's 0 followers. I was like, this is probably not legitimate. But if you look at it and they have like a work history, if people are engaging with them, good chance that they're legitimate. I mentioned I was speaking in Saudi Arabia. That was a cold outreach via LinkedIn. And first, when I got it, I was like, oh, this seems really fishy. And so, literally, I reached out to them and I was like, give me 2 or 3 different connections or people who've spoke at the event. And I actually outreached to those speakers. And so you can verify, right? You can say who are past guests that you've had, or you can go on, Apple Podcasts and see if they're, if they're a legitimate podcast. Anything to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with everything you're saying. I've had several interviews booked recently where people just messaged me on LinkedIn. So
Oh,
I
that
think
was
this is,
me.
yeah, you messaged me on LinkedIn and I had a couple interviews. And so I agree with what you're saying. What I always ask is, so some of the things that I always ask is, can you send me a link to the show? Like I want to see the show. Can you send me this request via email? Partly that's just because I don't want it to get lost in LinkedIn, but also I like to just kind of keep the conversation going. Like one person, when I ask for the link to their show, I will also ask, like, why are you interested in having me on the show? Because somebody recently reached out to me and my business partner actually, and it was a podcast for construction business owners. And I said, genuinely, I don't think construction business owners need to be on podcasts. Like, I don't think this is a great fit. Like, why are you asking me? And then his message back just seemed like it was almost like AI or somebody that,
Uh,
like, there was a weird disconnect. So just by asking some simple questions, seeing how they converse, you can do a vibe check. You can be like, okay, this sounds legit. This sounds real. But yeah, just basically checking out the show, looking at some previous episodes, having them email you the details. And from that, I'm like, yeah, this all checks out. This looks great. Sometimes you want to ask to make sure that they're not charging because that is happening more with podcast hosts is they kind of just they're like, oh, and by the way, it's $200. I'm not paying to be on your show. Like this is a value exchange.
don't pay to be on a podcast, guys.
Don't
Don't pay. Don't
pay.
do it.
And that is something to be wary of. Like really big podcasts are charging now.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, pay to play is coming in hot to podcasting and a lot of people are doing it cuz they're like I want to be on a show with 20,000 listeners. Like that sounds great and I mean everyone can make whatever choice they feel like is best for them, but you can get so much value out of smaller audiences where there's just a genuine connection with the host and there's an equal value exchange. So just be careful of that. And you know, only one time is a while ago where I kind of considered a paid placement because it was a really big show in my industry. And I asked the host, okay, I'll consider this, but can you send me your downloads? I need to know if I'm basically advertising. And he wouldn't send me the information. And I'm like,
Mm.
no. So if you're going to pay basically to advertise, you need to know the numbers. Just like you would expect to see stats on Facebook and meta ads. If you're going to pay to be on a podcast, you better get really like legitimate information about what their reach is.
And this is kind of related to the next question I'm going to ask you, but this is just advice for people who are watching this right now. Make sure you're also optimizing your website and your LinkedIn page. So, what are the call to actions? Like because people are going to watch the podcast, go to your website or go to your LinkedIn page. So, you need to maybe be able to answer the question, and then what, right? So, so talking about that, Jessica, what's your advice for turning podcast appearances into tangible results, such as increased business, brand visibility, etc.?
Yes. So this is a perfect question to continue what you were just talking about, optimizing your website and your LinkedIn. I want to just add to that. Optimize your LinkedIn, stay on top of your connection requests. I think some people get overwhelmed with LinkedIn and they're like, oh, well, there's just so many people spamming me. But if you've got 50 connection requests that you haven't gone through, there might be a potential client in there. There might be somebody wanting to book you on their show or to speak. So even though there are some people just soliciting and cold DMing you, you do want to keep your LinkedIn cleaned up because there's also opportunities coming to you. So that's what I'll say about that. But having an effective call to action is really important with podcast guesting. That is that is one of the biggest ways you're going to see a return on investment. So when you give a call to action at the end of a podcast interview, have it be one thing. So a lot of people will say like, "Oh, here's my website and here's my social media and you can find me here," and you'll give them like 5 different places, but most podcast listeners are on mobile. So they're not going to be at their computer where they can start typing in all of your CTAs. So give one call to action, and that call to action should be the next intentional stop on someone's journey to ultimately working with you, assuming they're your target audience. So, what is that stop? Is that joining your email list? Is that booking a call with you? Is it following you on LinkedIn? Like, whatever the best next step is, that should be your call to action. And I've had a lot of clients use connect with me on LinkedIn as their call to action because they know that once someone connects with them on LinkedIn, they send them a message, they get in conversation, they can kind of nurture them into, hey, let's connect, like let's get on a call and, see how we can work together. So you could send them to your LinkedIn. If you have a lead magnet that works really well and gets people onto your email list, you could offer a lead magnet, or it could just be going to your website. Go to my website. From there, you can either book a call or read some of my free resources, but just have a very clear next stop for the audience to connect with you and learn more about you.
I love that. And Linda, you have a great question. Do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to ask it for you?
Sure. I'll give
Awesome.
you a break.
Thank you.
So you're talking about call to action, which makes a lot of sense. My question would be, is one media have a higher response than another, whether it be website, LinkedIn, or the lead gen?
That's a great
question.
question. And it's truly different for different businesses and different audiences. So for some people, like financial advisors that I've worked with, for them, it works really well to send leads to a website where they can book a call because the founder, the entrepreneur that's out getting booked on podcasts isn't also doing all the sales calls and doing all of the things. So for them, it really, when you have a higher volume business and a lot more leads, you have a sales team, getting them to your website makes a lot more sense. For a higher ticket consultant, speakers, solopreneurs that maybe just have one assistant on their team, they don't necessarily expect or need thousands of people joining their email list, but if they get one client worth 100,000, that's really worth it. So sending them to LinkedIn makes a lot of sense. So those are just some of the things that I would look at to kind of question, but there isn't one thing, like one type of media that works better than others. It really is business and target audience dependent.
I love that. Anyone in the live Zoom audience have a question for Jessica? Otherwise, we will close this up. No? Okay, you can also unmute and ask your question. Okay, so Jessica, what's a one takeaway that you would want the folks on this call to take from this call?
So, if you're on this call and you want to be on podcast, the one thing that I would recommend doing after this in terms of taking action is to make a one sheet. You can go on Canva, write out, if you're kind of like don't really want to get into the design, just open up a Google Doc, write a 200-word bio in third person that a host could read to introduce you, write some 4 to 6 bullet pointed topics and write some questions. Just get your bio topics and questions out on a document. You can go to Canva and just search one sheet template and make a one sheet, but that is the one thing. If you want to be on podcast, you need a one sheet. That's what I would start with as a first action.
And go to her website because
Oh,
they
yeah.
have some really great. Like when I created my one sheet, I was like, oh, Google search.
Yes, go to interviewconnections.com. We would love to help you. We've got a lot of resources. And if you book a call, you'll be talking to me. So I would love to support you.
Awesome. So we all know the deal. For those who are in the live Zoom audience, put this in gallery mode. Turn on your video. This is the one time I ask you to turn on your videos and unmute. turn on your videos, unmute, because Jessica deserves a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, hopefully we get to see all of you guys on podcast. If you do get on a podcast for the first time, post it on LinkedIn and CC me and Jessica so we can cheer you on. And yeah, hope to see you guys around. And thank you so much, Jessica.
Everyone smile.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.